Next, I'd like to introduce Rachel Notley. And Rachel is the MLA for Edmonton-Strathcona. She was first elected in March of 2008. She's one of an NDP caucus of 2 in the Alberta legislature. Rachel Notley divides her time between 12 critical areas. These include environment, education, advanced education, seniors, children and youth services, and justice. Rachel Notley is a long-standing labour and environment advocate. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel.
Good afternoon, everybody. I do have to start by saying that I am lucky to divide myself between slightly fewer critic areas now that our caucus has gone up by 100% in the last election. So I think I've done about 7 or something now, so that's very exciting. I want to thank everybody for coming out here today and taking the time that you've taken both last night and all day today to sit here patiently and earnestly and intensely listening to all these folks. I know it's always hard when as politicians you say, oh, please don't let me go and speak somewhere where people are expected to sit and listen for more than 15 minutes at a time. But it's clearly a measure of your passion and commitment and concern about this issue that you all are here. So I really want to thank you for taking the time and being here today. I think that Jan did a tremendous job in to some extent introducing a little bit of what I want to talk about when he talked about how in his home country they were able to go from being the most polluted to the least polluted in the space of about 25 years as a result of government action. Because that's what I want to talk about, what we need to do and what we're not doing right now and what is going on in government in terms of reversing the trends that we see going on across the province. And I want to start by saying that as I talk, periodically I'll talk about government and I'll talk about industry, but I want to make it very clear that in my view, the people who bear the responsibility for what I'm going to describe are the leaders. They are the politicians. They are, quite frankly, the Conservative government. And I want to say that the people who work in the ministries and the bureaucrats and the staff, whether you're talking ERCB or environment or SRB or whatever, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the absence of regulation, the absence of standards, the absence of science, the absence of independence, these are political decisions that are made day in and day out, and full accountability rests with the government that we have elected in this province. The other thing I want to say is, even when we talk about industry, the fact of the matter is, and I'm putting on my lawyer hat here for a moment, the fact of the matter is, industry, particularly when you're talking about publicly traded industry, they are subject to the law, and the law requires them to maximize their profit, and if they don't do that, their shareholders can sue them. And so it's all fine to have voluntary guidelines and best practices and good feelings and great press releases, but at the end of the day, if that kind of work gets too close to undermining the profits, well then those corporations aren't doing the job that they're obliged to do. So the only way to ensure the best standards and the highest standards and the consistent application of those standards is for the government to make the rules which require all industry to play by those rules. And once again, that goes back to the issue of the people who are running the show, to the politicians who pass the legislation that Jan was describing repeatedly throughout his presentation. So what I'd like to do is cover a few areas that relate to the relationship between government, industry, and the land and the environment in this province, and give you a few examples of where we've seen government make the wrong choice and set out in the wrong direction. And I'll end talking about fracking, because of course that's what the primary issue here is this weekend. But I think it's important to have an understanding of the kinds of decisions that are being made in relation to the environment and in relation to the oil and gas industry generally across the province. So I'd like to start just really quickly by talking about just a quick review of the history of water monitoring in the lower Athabasca region and what the history is there with respect to the Alberta government. So basically, as you know, for decades and decades, people who live downstream from the oil and gas development in the oil sands have raised concerns that their water is being contaminated and that their health and the health of the wildlife and the health of the environment is at risk. And for those same decades, the government has reached out, patted them on the head and said, oh, don't worry, there is nothing wrong, we're testing, it's all good, there's nothing to show that there's any contamination going on, and you guys are alarmists, and you guys don't really know what you're talking about. This is really an urban myth in, Fort Chip that, greater numbers of people are dying from cancer and all that kind of stuff. And trust us, because we have the information. And I was in the legislature where a Minister of Environment repeatedly got up and said, any oiling or any contaminants in the water is naturally occurring and has not increased one bit because of industrial activity. And he said that with such certainty, he began to get, often a little bit insulting to those of us who might repeatedly get up and say, really? Really? We don't think so, and what are you going to do about this cancer rate and all that kind of stuff? So they said that, and thankfully, in 2010, as many of you know, Dr. David Schindler and his associates released a report which outlined an independent study of what was actually going on and what was impacting the water in that area. And of course, it's really important to understand that he was not funded by any of the typical Alberta or Canadian funders for that project. It was one where he had to go out of the country to get independent funders. This whole conversation we can have about our education system and our university, but anyway, it's a different story. And as you know, his study contradicted much of what the government had said. And then a couple of months later, as a result of his study, the Royal Conservatory of Scientists came out across Canada and said, yeah, you know what, there might be something going on here, you might be right. And so eventually the political pressure was so great because this was in and around the time of the duck fiasco, and I think a lot of us need to realize that we owe a lot to those ducks because the level of conversation around environmental issues would not have been raised to the extent that it was had we not had the duck issue. Anyway, so as a result, the minister was compelled to create a quasi-independent group of scientists to review why it was that the government on one hand was saying there was no contamination and these independent scientists on the other hand were saying there was. And so that first group came out and said, oh, gee, well, a little embarrassing. it's been 25 years or whatever, we've been telling you nothing's wrong. Turns out we never actually checked. Turns out we never actually did the tests we needed to be doing in order to make the assertions that we were making. Turns out we didn't have the equipment. Turns out we weren't in the right place. How silly us. Now, quite frankly, in my view, in any other democracy, that would have immediately precipitated the resignation of the minister, but this is over. Nonetheless, that having been the case, there was then sort of a tsunami of response, and everybody concluded that one of the single biggest problems with the water monitoring in that area is that it was being done by an industry-funded group, and it was being done by industry that was completely independent. Most of what they did was, of course, kept from the public. And so the government ran out to promise, we're going to have independent, transparent, scientifically assessed water monitoring, blah, blah, blah. You can count on us, Anyway, so in June of 2011, here's what we've got so far. They appointed a monitoring panel. About 8 or 9 months later, the monitoring panel recommended the creation of a monitoring working group. And then about a month ago, so we're in 2012, that working group recommended the creation of a monitoring management board. Now, each new creation became closer and closer to government, became less and less independent, reports through the minister sees everything, answers to the minister. Anyway, all that great stuff we heard about independence and transparency sort of gone out the window. They will talk periodically to scientists who are allowed to advise them, but they're no longer being driven by the scientists. Anyway, all that being said, nothing's actually happened yet. Industry has not yet agreed to fund this new monitoring. And RAMP is still doing the majority of the monitoring in the oil sands area. And interestingly, as many of you know, the Jack Pine hearings just commenced for there, and they're going to be making those decisions without the information that they need in front of them to talk about what is happening with water quality in that area. So that is an example of how the government works. It's a good instruction in how, when you're told, we have the answer, you don't. We have the facts, you don't. We have the science, you don't. Know that there is a very clear and public and gargantuan example of where that was never the case. And in fact, the government is very interested in moving forward in a way where people just stop their inquiry at the "we know, you don't" state. And so that is something that we're up against. Now, another area that we're very concerned about and that our caucus has raised repeatedly is the issue of pipelines and pipeline integrity. And we've had a bit of discussion about that already. Now, in Alberta, we have roughly 400,000 kilometers of pipeline, varied and functioning in some fashion or not, throughout the province. Now, Saskatchewan has about 25,000 kilometers of pipeline, so whatever that is, I think it's 1/20th of what we have. Now, they were worried about how things were working, so they appointed their Auditor General last year to do a review of whether their pipeline integrity is something that the public could trust and rely on. And that Auditor General, in a very transparent, independent way, produced a report this spring which said, well, actually, you know what, folks, we have a lot of work we need to do here. We don't have proper systems in place for monitoring, and when there are problems and industry is not compliant, we don't have processes in place or resources in place to make sure that they cleaned it up properly. And there was a number of things they said, but generally speaking, they concluded we have some big problems. The federal Auditor General, which has slightly more kilometers of pipeline under its jurisdiction, but nowhere near as much as Alberta, also did a report, which was released this year, and came to similar conclusions, that we don't have a good enough sense of the integrity of the pipeline that we got out underneath there, we don't have the systems in place to ensure its integrity, and we are not following up adequately with industry when things go wrong. So we thought, well, 80–90% of the pipeline in the country is underneath our ground. Maybe it might be a plan for Alberta to also do an independent audit of the integrity of our pipeline system, considering as well that in the last 2 years, 2 of the 3 biggest pipeline leaks in the country happened in Alberta, considering that last summer we almost poisoned red deer, considering that there's been a bit of stuff going on in the leaking pipeline world. Perhaps this would be a good time to try and get the government to finally ask the Auditor General to do an independent assessment. So we put out that request with someone that they do that. Well, first we asked them to do an independent review, and the Minister and the Premier looked at us and said, absolutely not, there is no need for that, forget it. You people are a bunch of hysterical alarmists, and no. So then we thought, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the Auditor General to do it. And it's possible, because the Auditor General is an independent officer of the legislature, and it's possible that given the fact that Saskatchewan and federal Auditor General had just done a similar one, that he would, on his own initiative, realize that it was something that needed to be done. So we made a formal request to the Auditor General. Within 4 days, the government was out with their own made in Alberta, slightly less independent version of a review. I'm sure cooked up so that they could convince the Auditor General not to do his own review. Their review, interestingly, has industry involved in it, and in fact, writing the terms of reference and reviewing the report and analyzing the report. And the Minister gets to see the report in it, and we may or may not ever see the outcome of that review, but that's going on right now. So here we are in Alberta, 80% of the pipeline in the country, roughly. Someone can tell me I'm wrong, but I think it's something like that. And we don't have an independent assessment of pipeline integrity in Alberta. This is the government that we're dealing with. This is the way they operate. They don't want transparency, they don't want independence, they don't want accountability. They want to work closely with industry behind closed doors at every opportunity. And for those people who think that the new Premier is going to somehow harbor in a new day on this issue, please don't think that. On the issue of the environment, there is no change. in the position of this government and the approach of this government to balancing interests between landowners, the public interest, and oil and gas on the other side. So I want to talk a bit about that issue as it relates to fracking. Some of you may or may not have been aware that about a little over a year ago, our caucus came into possession of some documents that would otherwise have been secret. And they were documents that is a briefing note to a minister combined with an agreement, a charter agreement that was put together between BC, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and in consultation, or between those three to work on the issue of fracking and coming up with some planning around fracking. And what the document showed, among other things, were a few things that were of a great deal of concern to us. One was, of course, that it wasn't just BC and Alberta and Saskatchewan that was taking part in the conversations about a tripartite set of best practices with respect to fracking. It was those three agencies and CAP. And they were doing it behind closed doors. Now maybe you think, well, CAP's kind of a player, maybe they should be at the table, and if they're really there to come up with the best rules and get the best research and do the best science and that kind of stuff, maybe that's not so unreasonable. It'd be nice if they were a little bit more public about it, but they're just trying to do their job. Well, the problem is, of course, is that the agreement made it very clear that they weren't actually interested, and it was very clear in the agreement. This was not geared to do new research or develop new science or assess new technology to devise best practices. This was geared to placate public opinion that was being unnecessarily whipped up by misinformed environmental groups. And that really it was about assuring the public that fracking is now and always will be safe. And so behind closed doors, we had these three governments getting together with CAP to come up with a communications plan for how to convince Albertans that they were being hysterical about fracking. Now, there was, of course, a million problems with that. An appeal was made to the lobbyist registry saying, why is CAP not actually disclosing this lobbyist, the fact that they're doing this? How do we not know about these conversations? And anyway, that's a whole other issue. The lobbyist registrar decided that there's no reason we should have known about those conversations, but as I say, another issue around transparency. But what they did is, what the documents demonstrated, and you can get them online if you haven't seen them, it was multifaceted. First of all, that the government is not reviewing the safety of fracking. The government has made its decision completely. And so they're not interested in investigating the safety, they're simply interested in convincing everybody that it should go forward as quickly as possible. What was very clear in the document was that their focus and their objective was to manage public opinion. It was not to find good science or best science. What was clear is that they were quite happy and thought it was entirely appropriate to work behind closed doors with industry to engage in the management of public opinion on that issue. So, this is what we're dealing with, and I go back to my first point. These are concerted, intentional decisions made by the politicians, the majority of whom form the government in this province right now, because in their view, there's an elevated status in our province for industry, which is elevated beyond and above that of the public interest of environmentalists, of landowners, of citizens, essentially. And so that's the regime that we're working with. Now, going on a little bit to, I think you may have already talked about this, Deb, but just in case you haven't, I want just to talk a little bit more about fracking. If you haven't seen it, the Nova Scotia government produced a document last spring, which is available online. I think it's dated, I've got a stack of papers here, but I think it's dated March or April, and it came out last spring. And what it was is it's an interjurisdictional comparison of regulations and standards on fracking between several U.S. states and BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick. I think those are 4 Canadian provinces, and then several U.S. states. And so it's a very helpful document. So anyone who's interested in pursuing that, you should get that document, because it talks about regulation on regulation. As I think you guys already know, we have no specific fracking regulations in Alberta right now. People are not, or companies are not necessarily required to request permission to frack. If they're using a well that's already been approved, there have been roughly 4,000 fracking operations that have gone forward, that have never been turned down. We have, I think you probably could talk about this already, but very quietly by the dead of night about this time last year, the government eliminated Alberta's well spacing regulations. So it is now possible for the limit on how many wells and how close they can be together has been removed. We're the only province of all those jurisdictions that I listed. We're the only one that doesn't have well spacing regulations anymore. It's clearly done at the behest of the oil and gas industry. It's clearly done over the objections of landowners and environmentalists, those few who were actually consulted. It's obviously a problem. The Alberta government itself, in the document that I'm referring to, admits that they have a problem with the proliferation of abandoned wells in Alberta and the failure rate of those abandoned wells and the likelihood of what they refer to as communication incidents between those abandoned wells once fracking begins. And so they are aware that there's an issue. There appears to be nothing, well, quite the opposite. There appears to be, not only are they doing nothing to fix it, but they just recently eliminated the well spacing regulation. As you know, we don't have to disclose in Alberta the materials in the fracking. We have no baseline water testing for fracking. And again, we're unique, or almost unique among the jurisdictions in not having that in place. We have no assessment of in-stream flow needs, and we do very little consistent testing or assessment of our surface water resources, which is a huge issue when it comes to fracking, and it's something that is often overlooked. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on fracking in this province. So what's the government doing on it? Well, Jan mentioned, Jan mentioned Bill 2, and we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but that's a piece of legislation that was introduced about a week ago, and it's a move to create a one-stop shopping, a single window of regulatory approval processes here in Alberta. And we're creating a new organization, theoretically arm's length from the government, so that they'll have plausible deniability. We're folding in much of what the Ministry of Environment does, much of what SRD does, well, all of what it does in relation to oil and gas, and slowly it will expand to the other groups, areas that it covers, into this one body. And then and then they will sort of go off and do testing where they see fit. There's a lot of concerns with this. Obviously there is, say what you will about the degree to which we've been able to get our Minister of Environment to actually assert his authority or do his job or her job throughout the period of time that we've had a Conservative Minister of Environment. But the fact of the matter is if you put them all together, what will happen is that the mandate of protecting the environment, the mandate of ensuring sustainable development will be subordinate to the mandate of growing the oil and gas industry. And so that's what they are doing with respect to this piece of legislation, which is very dense, that was just introduced last week. And people haven't had a chance, we haven't had a chance to have a lot of debate on it yet, but you're going to have to listen very carefully because they brought in this session and they're ensuring that we do most of our debate between the hours of 7:30 in the evening and 1:30 in the morning, because that's when the government most likes to pass legislation. So they're also in this legislation going to limit the number of people and the type of people who can appear as interested parties at hearings around applications for development. So what they are claiming is that they're expanding it because according to the ministers, well, we're going to invite everybody to be part of that front-end policy development process. And so everybody can be consulted there, but when it comes to the actual decision-making process around specific applications, the people who are allowed to participate in those will be very much limited under this new legislation. It essentially, in many ways, mirrors changes that you've seen coming from the Harper Conservatives, and is geared to streamline, in their own words, the approval process for energy development in Alberta. It also purports to abdicate the new agency's responsibility to consult with Aboriginal populations. So the legislation itself says we're not responsible for this anymore. We're not a Crown corporation, or we're not a Crown agency, we're at arm's length. So therefore we have no constitutional obligation to consult with Aboriginal communities. So that's a new clause in the legislation. And they also give themselves new authority to dismiss applications or dismiss objections and concerns if they believe they're frivolous and there's no appeal from those decisions to dismiss those concerns. So that's sort of a first round of what will be in that bill. It's, as I say, it's very dense and it will come out, but I do urge you to be very conscious of it, because if you think you're frustrated with environment and nursery right now, I think this new regulator is going to raise the bar in terms of everyone's frustration levels. And I think that as much as you can participate and engage the government on debate on this bill, the more you can do, the better. And as I say, debate will start next week. And I know they're going to do whatever they can to go as late as they can to push it through as quickly as they can. So that is the summary of what I'm going to talk about. So look at me. I think I'm done about 2 minutes before I'm supposed to be, right? So I think I will leave my comments at that point. I don't mean to sound so negative. I do believe there's an opportunity for us to change it. Government does have a role to improve all of the situations you guys have discussed this week, but it is political. It's not about just getting to the table and believing that if you just get the best information there, everyone will be reasonable. It's about vested interests. It's about conflicting interests. And it's about who the government makes these decisions ultimately represents. And so the reason we have amongst the most laissez-faire regulatory regime in this province is because of the political decisions that we have made. And it is only going to accelerate as we go forward. And so there's a solution, but it's not a science-based one. It is a political one. Thank you.